Since social media kind of went mainstream, a lot of people have started to realize the amount of things that the CIA is behind. You know, like the crack epidemic, MK Ultra, there's been a lot of compelling evidence about JFK. And while to us as Americans, it might be crazy to be like, oh my God, like the CIA is behind our literal head of state being assassinated potentially, which is why you may be interested to hear that Rome had its own group like that. And rather than just one conspiracy about potentially one head of state being killed, this group named the Praetorians actually killed 6 emperors directly and another 3 to 5 depending on how you rate it indirectly. For instance, in 192, after a deeply unpopular 12 years on the throne, Commodus was strangled in his bathtub by his wrestling partner. The plot was run by 3 people: his mistress, the wrestling partner, and interestingly, a Praetorian prefect named Latus. At this point, the Praetorians were now the most powerful faction in Rome, and basically had complete authority over who the next emperor was going to be. And importantly, every time a new emperor comes to the throne, they owe an incentive, like bonus, to the Praetorian Guard in order to secure their loyalty. Meaning that every time they chose a new emperor, they would continue to get a donative each time in order to initiate the next emperor. So after killing Commodus, they picked an old general named Pertinax. But the thing was, Pertinax couldn't or wouldn't pay the donative in time. And instead of smoothing it over with the guard, he started putting restraints on the guard because he was seeing their growing influence in what they were trying to do. He tried to turn them back into soldiers rather than kingmakers. So only 3 months into his reign, they killed him and put his head on a spike and paraded him through their camp. Seeing how their original plan had failed, they decided to come up with a more foolproof way of getting their bonus. So instead of just anointing a new guy and he'd promised he'd give them whatever, they decided instead to announce from the walls of their camp that the throne was up to the highest bidder. 2 bidders showed up. One was named Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, notably the father of Pertinax, the emperor that had just been killed, and the other one was a man named Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, who rushed down to the bidding as soon as he heard about it. Some accounts have them shouting back and forth like a true modern auction to, the man up on the ramparts who was facilitating the auction. It ended up being that Didius Julianus outbid Sulpicianus. The final offer worked out to 25,000 sesterces, an enormous sum. To put it into perspective, the average soldier at the time was being paid 900 to 1,200 sesterces a year. About 20 to 25 years worth of pay in a single lump sum. The guard let him in with open arms and paraded him around as the emperor, but the rest of the people are pretty upset about it. The Roman citizens themselves, the senators, and most importantly, the armies on the borders, because the actual armies are out on the borders patrolling. So 3 separate armies all declared their own general the emperor and would not acknowledge Didius Julianus, because, you can't sell the throne like property. It's more about power, and the shit they were doing in Rome was all fugazi. It wasn't real. 66 days later, kind of caving to this pressure, the Praetorians abandoned Didius Julianus, and afterwards the Senate condemned him to death. He was executed, reportedly famously saying to his executioners, "What evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" The emperor is a dangerous job. So I guess the real question here is, why did the emperors, the supreme head of state, let the Praetorians get so much power over them? Praetorian-style elite guards go back to the Republic. Praetorium is the original Latin word it derives from, which meant a general's tent on campaign in the Republic. When Augustus came to power, he formalized it in 27 BC. He created 9 cohorts of roughly 4,500 men in total and stationed them all across Italy, so they couldn't really, combine forces or anything. They were constantly being moved around because notably, there was no other armies in the Italian peninsula because it was so insulated from the actual enemies of Rome at this point. They were also all Italian-born because the Romans thought that they were inherently more trustworthy and honorable. But even so, as I said, Augustus, he stationed them everywhere because he didn't want one army right outside of Rome. He saw the king-making possibilities that would lead to. He also paid them double what normal legionaries make, so they were already a little bit spoiled, if that makes sense. But he wanted a visible symbol of his power and dominance in the Italian peninsula, and he wanted to be able to quell like little squabbles between peasants or whatever in the actual Italian peninsula. But unfortunately for Rome, Augustus would not live forever. And after his death, his stepson Tiberius would ascend to the throne. And Tiberius is a little bit more, he's kind of a withdrawn leader. He doesn't really seem to care that much about being the emperor. He doesn't really want the job. So because of that, he starts to delegate a lot of the responsibility. He goes to Capri, an island in the Mediterranean, and just sends dispatches from there and tries to rule the empire from there. Obviously, there's a lot of problems with that. Most importantly, a man named Sejanus is going to start accumulating a lot of power. The biggest move he makes in the beginning is becoming the sole Praetorian prefect, whereas before there were 2, now there was just 1, which again, another part of Augustus's structure was being ignored. And because of this, he was able to convince Tiberius 8 years later that all 9 cohorts should be in one spot, right outside of Rome. So now he brought all 4,500 men in the Praetorian Guard to a camp right outside of Rome, a fortified camp. He sold it as like, you know, we're gonna be more disciplined, gonna be some more cohesion, the guard will be better for it. And, you know, Tiberius was kind of busy doing some freaky stuff out in the Isle of Capri, so he's like, go for it, bro. I trust you, you got this, you're my boy. But, you know, it was actually more so Sejanus could continue to consolidate power. He became, you know, the de facto second in command, and, you know, he was the real presence in Rome and in the empire, and sources even suggest that he was more feared than Tiberius himself at this point. However, you know, other delegates finally convinced Tiberius of Sejanus's master plan, and he had him executed, which, you know, is an important moment to step back and be like, wow, the emperor's prestige and legitimacy was still so overarching that the Praetorians couldn't do anything yet. He was still part of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a direct descendant of Augustus himself, and therefore Caesar, and therefore the gods, Venus. So there was still a lot of legitimacy. And it also feels like an important time to bring up like why an institution like the CIA or the Praetorians are able to do this. And it's because they stay in place over the decades. Administrations and emperors, they kind of come and go. And a new administration in the US comes in, and, you know, the president has never been the president before. The cabinet he's with has never been in the cabinet before. Whereas the CIA, over all these decades, they're always in place. They're always an institution. They're able to continue to gain power. They're able to exert influence over a longer period of time. So just like the emperors, you know, the Praetorian prefect might change, but it as an institution is existing longer than all of the individual emperors. So therefore, they become more entrenched into it, just like the CIA. And that's why we see intelligence around the world, you know, has a huge part in power and politics. And depending on what you believe, maybe even the dominant force. But the legitimacy and prestige that Tiberius had can't be said about his successor Caligula. You know, likely due to his really extraordinary circumstances growing up, being essentially exiled on the Isle of Capri with the most powerful person on the planet. You know, he grew up and was not very well adjusted to Roman society and really didn't know how to act or really how to do much of anything in politics. It was really quite a flawed idea that he would be the one taking over. And he was killed by a Praetorian tribune named Cassius. You know, kill counter right up here or something. What's going on? So he wasn't the prefect and he wasn't a rank and file. He was kind of in between. And he had some personal reasons as well, which I found interesting. And reportedly, Caligula actually mocked him constantly, you know, mimicking his voice, giving him deliberately humiliating watchwords. I don't really know what that means, but, you know, I kind of get the idea. Caligula was stabbed repeatedly and died pretty much immediately. With Caligula dead, the consuls convened in the Senate almost immediately, and there was a real serious debate about restoring the Republic, you know, abolishing the Principate altogether and just not picking a new emperor, which, you know, you have to remember at this point, Caligula, he's only the third emperor ever. And it's a little bit different because, you know, Augustus and Tiberius, you know, lived to a pretty old age and ruled for such a long time that no one was really alive when the actual republic was a thing. But having a dud so quickly into this new system like Caligula, you know, naturally caused some questions. But with all 4,500 of the Praetorians, you know, right on the scene, they took initiative because senators don't have swords. You know, what's fascinating about ancient politics is it's really just whoever has the most swords. It kind of dictates what happens to millions of people across the empire. Taking initiative looked like they went in and found his uncle Claudius, Caligula's uncle that is, hiding behind a curtain. He was kind of like a feeble, like very mocked guy. And, you know, they took him right to their camp and announced him as emperor. Claudius reportedly promised 15,000 sesterces. So going back to our comparison, this is a different time period, but, you know, still like over a decade's worth of pay just in one lump sum, which now is an important time to remember that Rome had well over 100,000 soldiers employed across the empire at any given time. And here, in the heart of the empire, 4,500 troops with zero combat experience are deciding everything for the empire. And on top of deciding it themselves, they're getting paid literally decades worth of money to do it as well. The armies and generals on the border were simply too far away. You know, they likely had like a really rough, outdated understanding of what was happening in Rome at any given time due to how hard it was to transport information at the time. Claudius had a surprisingly prosperous 13 years and kept the guard well paid, and they didn't really seem to cause too much of a fuss. For another 100 years, the power of the Praetorians would go back and forth, kind of in this same range of power, until Commodus inherits the throne from his father, Marcus Aurelius. For a stretch of Commodus's reign, he let a freedman, meaning he was a slave that was freed within his lifetime, named Cleander, effectively buy his way into massive influence. over the guard and the imperial administration. At one point, Cleander held the Praetorian prefecture alongside other offices in Rome, an absolutely unprecedented level of power for a freedman in Roman society. It ended in 190 when a grain shortage caused everyone to kind of get pissed at Commodus, and rather than take responsibility or something, he blamed Cleander and had him killed. But that level of corruption and factionalism within the Praetorian Guard did not go away, which brings us back to Latus, the Praetorian prefect that was responsible for killing Commodus, which is a pretty cool thing to be remembered by when you really think about it. After that, as you might remember, they replaced him with Pertinax, who was soon killed, which led to the auction where Didius Julianus won and became emperor, but was killed pretty quickly. When we get to where we left off, where 3 armies on the borders rise up in revolt from this Didius Julianus thing. He's killed before any of them even get remotely close to Rome. The armies were led by Septimius Severus. He was commanding the legions on the Danube River, a very important border for the Romans. The second man was Pescennius Niger, the governor of Syria at the time, another very important post, and a man named Claudius Albinus, the commander in Britain, who he kind of jumped the gun a little bit, or at least the troops who elevated him did, because his position was far weaker than the other two. Pescennius had the numerical advantage in the east in Syria. That was where, most of the troops in the empire were mobilized, and he controlled the largest swath of it. But in ancient warfare, geography and circumstance usually play an equal role to that of just numbers. So Severus was much closer to Rome, being on the Danube border. Pescennius in Syria was really relatively incredibly far from Rome. So Severus marched on Rome with a relatively very large battle-hardened army. The Praetorians were outnumbered at least 4-1, so they kind of had to listen to him when he summoned them outside of the city, unarmed and in ceremonial dress, supposedly to swear loyalty to him. Then, which they did not anticipate, he surrounded them with his own legions, stripped them of their garments, and banished them from Rome. The whole Praetorian Guard, forbidden to even come within 100 miles of the city. So that would lead to the end of the Praetorians killing and deposing emperors and getting paid like tech bros for it. This video was shot in Utah. This is southern central Utah on I-70. Beautiful, beautiful country. This is right off the highway. You probably heard a truck or two during this video. Yeah, have a great day.